well. Thanks for coming back. I am happy to have Daniel back on. I actually had a couple of conversations with Daniel with you on some designs that we could implement in regards to. Initially, I had a customer scenario where they wanted an ability to slice, so to speak, a report tooltip page, which isn't technically feasible. You can't click inside of it at any point, but they wanted to cycle through different filters, and I gave it some thought. And after a while, I found one additional use case for the play axis, but I found that one of the limitations with this is the fact that there's nothing that really indicate when the thing is going to flip over, whether or not it's 5 or 10 seconds. So it can be a little jarring to have something almost like ripped out of in front of you as you're reading it. So it would be good to have some type of a visual or countdown. And my first thought is custom visual, and of course I thought of you again, and some of the stuff that Deneb and the Vega Lite platform can do. So I know reaching out to you last month, you were able to come up with some initial concepts, and it seems like you have a few examples that we'll get into today that actually seem to work very well as far as helping to provide that that visual countdown to tell people when the filter context transition is going to change on the report page tooltip.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Reed. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's always good to get some really interesting challenges come up. So I really liked your solution where he was cycling through a tooltip. A report page tooltip comes up, and you get to use the play axis to cycle through some categories and give a little more insight. And yeah, that visual indicator was a real fun challenge. So in doing that, I found quite a lot of quirks with things like the play axis. Also learned a lot more about what we can do with Deneb potentially. So I thought it was a really good opportunity, and I really appreciate you bringing me along for it.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to have you back on. I think this is at least the third or fourth time, and considering some of the other stuff we're also potentially building on the side, I think it might be it's sometime in the near future as well. You potentially could be showing off something with me as well. There's a lot of things that can be built in Denim, which I'm
Oh yeah,
been
yeah.
loving to see the
I'm never
traction
getting bored.
continuing to deploy about this.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, I don't want to say the only limit is your imagination, because there are limits, but it's always incredible what ideas people have that can spark all kinds of creativity. And I'm not the most creative person by far in this area, but and it's great to see that there are many more creative people out there that are making use of it. But these technical challenges that can result in some really good insight are a lot of fun to work out, and hopefully there'll be something useful for people to take away today.
Absolutely. We can go ahead and get started. I see you're sharing the desktop file, so I'll flip over to that and
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
take it
of
from
course.
there.
So we'll do a quick recap. So you did a video recently that walked through this, and
Hmm.
I have a blog post that I wrote following up from that and following our discussion, where I kind of jumped straight into the idea of how we could approach something like this. Um, but you have your report here, and just for the people that are unfamiliar, so we've got this visual here where we've got a breakdown of sales details by country, and each country has some categories down here: regular, deluxe, and economy. So what I've done here is I've wired up your report page tooltip so that if I hover over a row, we get this nice canvas tooltip that comes up. And as I hold it up and talk, you can see that roughly every 3 seconds, it's cycling through. So as I'm talking, the categories are changing, and it's going through regular, deluxe, and economy. Um, but what we're kind of talking about the problem that we don't really have an indicator to say in so many seconds it's going to change. We just have the bar chart, and all of a sudden it updates. And that's what we're hopefully going to sort of do through Deneb today, to just enrich that a little bit. So it's quite an interesting challenge. Um, and when we talk about Deneb, we've got two languages in there. So when we've done videos before, Reed, we've always used Vega Lite, which is kind of the highest level
Hmm.
of language in Deneb, because it's really easy to use. It's great for common use cases, but there are some limitations in there. I'm just going to pop a quick slide up that sort of hopefully articulates this a little bit. So I like to sort of say this, yeah, the less abstraction you have, the more you can do, but it takes more effort. So when we think about the visual layer in Power BI, that runs on web technologies: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And JavaScript is the language we have to work with. It does anything really dynamic inside a web container or a web page, we have to write JavaScript code. So this is the bare metal for us. This is where if we want to, we write this code to do things in a web page. Um, and usually when we think about Power BI visuals, whether you're building a custom visual, whether you're looking at the core visuals, there's some tooling there. So you've got d3.js, which is a very popular JavaScript, what they call a visualization kernel. So it is a set of tools that are written in JavaScript that sit on top of JavaScript that let you do common use cases, but you still have to write a lot of code. But they're very, very handy for those of us that like to do that. But it's still quite close to the bare metal. And then on top of that, you've got Power BI API. So that's dealing with things like tooltips and cross filtering and that kind of stuff. And that's all in JavaScript as well. So that's all encapsulated quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But then we've got the tooling of Deneb. So firstly, the University of Washington folks, we've talked about this before, they built a language called Vega. And Vega is a JSON-based language that sits over the top of D3. And it lets us automate some of the stuff a bit more easily. So D3 lets us create elements on the page. It lets us manipulate them and do things. And Vega gives us a gateway to that. Vega Lite, the one we're used to, sits over the top of Vega. So you write a simpler design like a bar chart or a line chart, or you can get quite prescriptive with that. And that gets compiled down to Vega, and Vega gets kind of compiled to this JavaScript that runs D3. And then we're kind of producing our results. So we're kind of going further up the stack, and we get simpler things. But with Vega Lite, we don't quite have the things to do that you're looking to do, Reed. So we don't have the ability to do event management and things like that you can do in JavaScript. And then on top of that, we have Power BI and Deneb. And why not put a little Henry in there for fun? So with Vega, we have the concept of things called event streams. And event streams are ways of binding dynamic events more primitively. So in Vega Lite, they give you kind of prescribed ones like click events or drag events and special language constructs to handle that. With Vega, you can actually bind to click events or double click or the mouse wheel if you want, certain touch events if you're using tablets, that kind of thing. And then we also have other things like timers that we can use. And this is the kind of stuff we're going to look at today. But one thing we found, oh, sorry, Reed, what's up?
Yeah, no, I'm just sorry, I'm not nodding in agreement. Okay. No, like I always learn a little bit more about the various platforms within Light and Vega and everything else. So it's a learning opportunity for me too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is what we're trying to do. So when we do Deneb, we always focus on Vega Lite because it's easy for beginners and newcomers to get into it. But when you start thinking visually, Vega's quite cool as well, and you can do a lot more in Vega if you're prepared to roll up your sleeves and do the work. But one thing I sort of noticed, and it might be a good idea if I just bring the Play Access Tooltip page up here, Reed, is when we're cycling through, and it's really hard to show without the finished product, we can see that roughly every 3 seconds, things are changing. But the regular one, which is the first one, or the last one in the cycle, as the case may be, because it's sorted alphabetically, hangs around a little bit longer. So these are changing quite quickly, but the regular one's just kind of sitting there just a little bit longer. And I'm just going to have to find the play axis this page, because the trick to making this work is you have to have a visible play axis, but it's kind of hidden behind the other chart.
Yeah,
So,
unfortunately, it does not tick through and run in the background.
no,
Any filters applied to it at the time of hiding might, but otherwise, it
yes.
basically it deactivates.
But this is a common trick. I do this as well. But it's really neat because you can keep it on the page, it's active and it's running, but your other chart sits in front of it. Now, in the play axis slicer, we've got this time in milliseconds. So 3000 milliseconds is 3 seconds. So what it's trying to do is it's going through the process of slicing. But we observe that even though it's 3 seconds, I mean, we'll see this as we go through, this regular one causes us a bit of a headache because it's sitting there longer than the others. And I've got this little slide here that kind of breaks that down a little bit. So what sort of happens is if we imagine this timeline, and these are the categories that exist in our current dimension table, every 3 seconds, it's roughly going through the name and it's slicing. So it'll slice here, and then it'll change to economy, and then we'll wait 3 seconds, and then it'll do another slice. It'll change to regular. And then when it gets here, it's almost like it sort of sits and waits for another loop. And that's what we sort of see with regular. So this sort of doesn't really do anything. until it hits here, and then it loops back around and starts again. And from a visual perspective, visuals on a page in Power BI, they don't really talk to each other in the sense that they can know what's happening. So we know there's a slice event in any other visual on the page. So the bar chart, for example, it knows that the slice is happening, but it relies on the slicer to tell us that something's changed. And this is the challenge we have with trying to build this solution, is that we're putting a new visual on the page using Deneb, but we don't know about this here. And these categories, we don't know enough about them because of the context in which they're being used. So they may all exist and we may cycle through all of them, or because we may have a chart with a reduced set, we don't know where this is going to end and where it's going to loop. So it could be one iteration, it could be 20 iterations, it could be 1,000. We don't know. So this is a really tricky thing that we have to think about. And for the cases
And I
of
would say
simplicity,
you could, yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit. I was mentioning that one option would be to um, maybe have it attached to these, like a sort ID or something else, where if it, when it hits three, it knows to loop back. But also, if there's
Mm,
certain filters during the hover or filter context that you're hovering over that is missing certain pieces that doesn't necessarily have the correct sort order, it might incorrectly loop back early or something else, I would imagine.
yeah, so I think I went through a lot of ways of possibly dealing with this. So it could be a case where you always know that it's going to hit a certain value, and you could put a condition in the. This is the nice thing about the language, is you could write a condition that said if it's regular, then just stretch it out. But we don't have that luxury today, and it's probably a little bit complex. But it's something that for you as a viewer here that might be interested in this, this is a
Hmm.
situation that you could apply. What we're going to do today is we're going to introduce a concept where we know what our interval is. We know it's 3 seconds, but if it goes over this, we'll just reset the interval and count down again as if we're looking at a different series. Um, it's not what I would think is an ideal solution, but for the purposes of teaching, you can go any way you want. User experience is an interesting
Hmm.
field, so I'm trying to keep it fairly simple, and it's a quirk that we have to deal with somehow. So today I'm just going to assume that if the counter goes below 0, it's going to reset at 3 until the loop gets hit. And I think anything you see today, for you as a viewer, you as someone that wants to maybe use this approach, you may find a more elegant way of doing it, and that'd be great. It'd be really cool to know about that. Um, so let's have a think. Let's hide that play axis slicer. No, we don't hide it. We keep it behind. There we go. We
Yes,
keep
there
that
you go.
visible.
Excellent.
We don't mess it up. So what we're going to do today is we're going to just do something very, very simple. So I'm going to walk through an idea of let's show you. So we have a separate page here with a play axis slicer that's doing exactly what was on the other page. And I've just got this visual here, which has got this bar that sort of just animates down. So it starts at the one side, and it gradually over the time period, and we can see that it's slicing above, and every time there's a
Hmm.
change in the
Hmm.
slicer, it resets and it counts back down again. So this is just going to serve as a simple visual indicator for us. But we can see regulars doing 2 loops. So that's what we're doing today. We're just, we're going to assume that our viewers are okay with a second loop, but they kind of can see what's happening. So how are we going to do that? Well, first thing we do is we're going to add a Deneb visual to the page. And I'll keep it roughly the same size for now, just because it helps when we're
Yep.
editing. Deneb needs some data. So for the purposes of being consistent, I'm just going to add the class field that you see here to the data set. So when we've added that in, we can now create our specification. So I'm going to open this visual up and click on the advanced editor. And because this is a new visual, we get the option to create a new specification. We normally stay with Vega Lite because, as I say, it's great for newcomers, but today we're going to
Hmm.
look at Vega. Now, one of the key differences between Vega and Vega Lite is that Vega uses more primitive language. The language is actually simpler than Vega Lite, but because it's simpler, you have to wire more things up. But that can
Oh,
make it more
okay.
powerful for you. Yeah.
So there's less
So
syntax sugar in the
that's
post
exactly
text, and
right.
like
So
things
yeah,
are not packaged as much together.
that's right. So Vega Lite's language structure is easier to get into, but it's
Hmm.
actually a lot more broad. But if you're building a particular chart, it's great because it makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
With Vega, you have to break things down even more into more primitive elements. But all we're doing here is drawing a rectangle. So that's pretty basic. So we'll create an empty chart. And we now have our page. And we've got let me just bump up the font size a bit. How's that? Is that okay?
Yep. I can read that just fine.
Jolly good. Now, we've also got the ability we've got this debug pane. I don't know if we've covered this since I've last been on, but this was a change we put in version 1.3. So what this lets us do is it lets us inspect our data set. So we can see actually, if you look down here, that our class field is actually rotating. And that's because the play axis is still working in the background. So this actually lets us debug while editing. Now, this is something you may not want to do. And if you don't want to do that, you go back and you turn off the play axis slicer temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today, because we can see that even though we have 3 classes in our data set, we only get one because it's a slicer. So when I said about possibly using the name as a condition, this could change. So we're not going to worry about that. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at what are called signals. And signals are specification-wide parameters. Think of them as conditional formatting. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. Or properties you can add in pane that are totally flexible. So we have some here that are inbuilt. We can see that we have the width and the height. That's the actual physical width and height that the container takes up on the canvas. And we've got some auto size and padding settings. These are things that Vega puts in. And we add a couple called PBI, container height and width, which we can use for special Power BI type things. We're not going to use them, but they are populated by Deneb to help developers. What we're going to do is we'll just make the visual a bit bigger so we can see the whole thing. Zoom in and just get a bit more detail. Even though it's a rectangle, we'll still be able to see it better on the video. We have our data binding. We don't necessarily need it, but we'll keep it in. And we have our marks. So right now, this is an empty array. What we're going to do is we're going to extend this table of signals because we're going to create some expressions that let us do things on a timed basis. So what we'll do first of all is we will add in our initial signals. And what I'm doing here is I'm just adding a signals object, just like marks. I'm typing in one called interval. And what you'll see, readers, has an init property, and that's the initial value. And I've set that to 3000. What that means is that's the same value as our play axis slicer. And we've got one called start time, which uses the now expression. This is an inbuilt expression that Vega offers that lets us calculate the exact timestamp of when the visual updates. So our logic here is when our play axis updates, that's going to refresh the Deneb visual. And that start time will reset. And the interval is the same as the play axis. So unfortunately for us, firstly, I'll save that. And what we should be able to see is, and hopefully this is clear, is down here, we've now got an interval which says 3000. And we've got a start time. And you can see this start time here. It will refresh in just a sec. There you go. You see it just changed.
Yeah.
And again, there you go. So what this is doing each time the play axis is hitting the visual, it's making that start time change. And this is what's known as a timestamp. This is how JavaScript keeps time. This is the number of milliseconds since the 1st of January 1970. You can turn it into human readable dates, but we don't need to worry about that for now. This is just a yardstick for us. Now, what's a shame is we have to initialize this value manually. And it would be cool if the play axis had conditional formatting. And if it did, we could populate that from a measure. But unfortunately, because this is manually input, we have to manually input in here too. So if you change that play axis, you would change this value as well. But
Gotcha.
The reason we declare it at the top is because it's easy to see and it's easy to change.
Yeah,
So the
especially
next
when you
thing
come back in later on and edit. So I agree.
absolutely.
It's a good spot to put it. Yep.
Yeah, but I think if the play axis ever did get something like conditional formatting, you could have a measure, and you could make the measure part of the data set,
Hmm.
and we could have it in here, and then we can manipulate it to become a signal. But that's maybe a blue sky thing. We can't really do that yet, so let's not worry about it. So what we need to do now is, now we've got the interval that we're working to, and we've got the time of the visual refresh. We now need to add a counter, so a way of tracking how that's going, because at the minute it's not really doing very much. So I'll now add in another signal, and I'm going to call that counter. So I'm going to initialize that with the value of interval. So that's that 3000. That's declared higher up. And then what's cool now is we can actually bind events. So we looked at that page before where it said we could have clicks or various other things. What we can actually do is we can say on a timer, and we have a throttle property, and we're setting that to 75 milliseconds because we want it to run quite frequently during the life cycle of our visual. So our visual is going to hit, it's going to refresh every 3 seconds, every 3000 milliseconds, but we want to make sure there's some dynamic stuff in that time. So what we're saying right now is every 75 milliseconds, update that value with the interval, which is 3000,
Okay, okay.
minus the current timestamp that's happening when that event fires, minus the start time. So it's basically a way of saying how many milliseconds have elapsed since the visual refreshed. So let's refresh, let's apply that. And we can see now we have a counter. And it's not refreshing because it's cruel. Let's see. Ah, there we go. It's
Oh, there
caught
you
up.
go.
I think it's possibly because of the screen sharing, which is a bit of a shame. But we can see that it changes briefly. Let me see if I can put the throttle down to maybe 10. 10 is probably a bit extreme, but let's see what happens. There we go. So every 10 milliseconds. I think it's possibly an issue to do with the streaming and the screen refresh. But we can see here that our counter is now counting down really fast. So
Hmm.
every 10 milliseconds, it's doing the difference between the interval, the start time, and the current time that's internal. And we can see, if we look, every now and again, it goes down to 0, and then it
Yeah, okay, yeah,
goes
okay. You
negative.
watch it in real time, essentially.
Yeah, it goes negative. And that negative change is where our cycling happens. Wrong window. That's great. There it is. Where the cycling happens. So this negative period is this period here. That's what we're sort of dealing with. So that counter gives me something I want, but what I'll do, and just for space, I'm going to collapse these down. I think we know what these mean now. So I'm going to make some space in here. I'm going to add another signal that's very, very similar. And now I'm going to call that counter underscore ADJ, so counter adjusted. And it's going to be set up with the same pattern as before. And there's a little bit of a different logic in here. So I will just make a change to make that keep up with the other one. Set that to 10 milliseconds. And what it's saying here is, on the update, if the counter value here is less than 0, we add the interval to the counter to kind of make it subtract from the multiple of the
That's
interval,
when
if
it
that
goes to the
makes sense.
negative.
So it kind
Okay,
of it
yeah,
kind of does
yeah,
a
yeah.
reset, but deals with the negative value. Otherwise, just make it the counter value. So it's a little hack for us to kind of have a counter that keeps in time with our interval.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'll just collapse this one and I'll apply. And what we should get now is we get 2. We got our counter and our counter adjusted. You can see they're basically the same until counter goes negative, and then counter resets.
Yeah, yeah, okay,
So
okay.
we'll watch that happen again.
Nice. Okay, yeah,
Of
yeah,
course, it's
yeah.
not doing it while I want to. There we go. There's the negative
There, yeah,
counter,
yeah.
and our
Now it's
adjusted
going into the
counter
negative. Okay, okay, okay.
wraps around. So what we've done now is we've kind of built a way of handling that situation for the requirement that I've laid out. So that's kind of cool. Now we've got these updating, so we know that something's happening logic-wise inside our visual, but let's actually do something visually now. So in the mark section, I'll add my rectangle. And what we can see as I type here, this is probably a little more involved than if you've seen Vega Lite. Vega Lite's a bit easier to get started. So normally you just put bar and then bind the X and the Y and you're kind of done. With Vega, it's a bit more primitive. And we'll unpack this in just a second when it's finished. Let's apply that. And right now we can see our visual now has this full height and width rectangle in gray. So breaking down what we've done, we've said it's X coordinate and it's Y coordinate. And with X and Y, it's not like how we might do a line chart where our X is 0 and our Y is 0 here, and they go like that. With web pages and coordinate systems, it actually starts from the top here. So X is normal to us, but Y moves down. And
Yeah,
this
that makes
is
sense.
the thing we regard as, when we bind data to this, we would have something called a scale to convert those physical coordinates to logical ones and vice versa.
Hmm.
We don't have to worry too much about that today because we're not doing anything data bound really, except for our variables. But what we're saying is start it at 0, 0, and then its height is bound to this signal here, 210. So it makes it 210 pixels high automatically. And its width is bound to the 346. So that's 346 pixels wide. So if I jump out of here and I resize that slightly and I go back in, my width is now 322 and my height is 170, but the rectangle still fits within the bounds. So we've got
Okay.
this nice stretchy rectangle that's going to fit our container.
Perfect.
And of course, the JSON has expanded. So the other thing we've done is we've added a fill, which is a color. So that's just a nice gray. It could be black if we wanted it to be. We could apply opacity to it, or all the things we can do with marks in Vega Light, we can do in Vega and more. But this is just saying, build me a simple square that fills the container. The other thing we've got here is what's called enter. So this is what's known as an event for what we call the data join. So with D3, the JavaScript library that sits underneath, when you're binding to data, you have to think that your data may change. So we have 3 events. We've got enter, update, and exit. So enter is when an element is drawn for the first time. The update event is when it updates. So right now we're just drawing it on the canvas. So with enter, we create all the initial values. And this is just saying when the visual refreshes, every time do this first. So draw this rectangle exactly as seen. And right now, all we're seeing is that event. What we need to do now is think about when our timer is counting down, what happens to this rectangle? And that's what we'll do next. So we'll add another signal.
Excellent.
And the strategy here is I've set my width of the rectangle to be the width of the container. What's going to happen when I count down is I want that width to reduce, so that I've got something visible happening. And the way for me to do that is to think, well, I've got 3,000 milliseconds in my window, and I've got, at the minute, 322 pixels to fill, and it could be different. So what we'll do is we'll build a signal, and I'm going to call this unit width. And what that's going to do is it's just going to give me a way of saying, for each time this runs, how many pixels would the interval need every time that runs? So the width divided by the interval. So 322 divided by 3,000. And let's run that. And we now get unit width, which is 0.107. So we've got that for each cycle of the clock, that's how many pixels we need to think about. So 0.107 pixels. What we then need to think about is how does that translate to the width of the bar? So let's collapse these down, give us some room.
I like a lot of the considerations that goes into relative sizing. Not only is the resolution of this the computer, but then the size of the container and other elements that go into that. I do want to point out, by the way, the in those little moments, I'd like to think Daniel is the world's fastest typer. He has wonderful. I still have yet to use it, but I believe you have your Stream Deck mapped to these. You basically copy paste and it types it out for you, including carriage returns.
Yeah,
right?
I do. So for me, talking and typing is really hard. So for any Stream Deck users, I use something called Super Macro. Unfortunately, you saw a little bug there where I think some transient event made it kind of go a bit funny, but I've just fixed that up. But yeah, this is great for me because I can, if you've got to watch me type and think and then explain it, we're going to be here 3 times as long.
That's
So
fair. Yeah.
what I've got here is I'll just change that to 10 as well because everything's running on the same clock. What I'm doing here is I'm now creating a new signal called bar width, and I'm initializing that with the width of the container. And when that timer runs on the same cycle as the others that we used for the counters, we're going to change that value to be the unit width times the adjusted counter. So this 0.107, we're going to multiply it by the adjusted counter, and it's going to give us a fraction of the width based on the counter value. So when I run this, I may have to jump onto the next page because we only get 10 signals on a page here. Let's just go across. There we go. So we now have this bar width, which is, you can see it's counting down as well, but it's counting down as a proportion of that physical width, which is great. And now for something you can actually see, we will find our marking coding. So we've got our enter here, that's been done. So we'll now add in our update. And this is a way of saying when something happens inside the visual, outside of the creation cycle from Power BI, what do we do? And all we're saying here is update that rectangle's width with this bar width that we've calculated. So when we apply that, it's now reducing.
Nice. Okay.
And we see that it goes down. And then when this, we got that initial weird one because we may have come in mid-cycle from the play axis. We can't time it perfectly, but then it will sync up. So we can see now it's counting down from 3 seconds to 0, and then it's cycling around. And then in the case where it goes negative, it resets and gives us an extra kind of window, but it at least is consistent with the interval we're seeing in the interface.
Yeah,
So we
absolutely.
talked earlier about if we wanted to change the interval, let's make it 10 seconds. We change that to 10,000 milliseconds, and we apply, and we now get a slower count, but it's still nice and smooth. And that's not counting all the way down because the play axis is interrupting, but that's how you would change the interval. So we'll set that back to 3,000 for consistency. And then that's basically this one done. So we can jump back to the report, and we can now see it's basically the same as what we've got here. What we'll do to make it fit on your play axis page is we'll change the height and the width because those tooltip pages are real tiny.
Yeah.
So we'll change it to 32 by 360, and we can see now that it's a bit slimmer. We'll cut that, and we'll put it on the page. And we'll just hopefully be able to grab it with the mouse and move it down to the bottom. So we can see that it's counting down, and our bar is cycling. With the regular, it's pausing, but it's looping, and then it goes back. And looking at our report.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just saying, yeah, like I like the integration of the bar at the bottom too. I think that it allows for, and the other one that I'm curious for you to show that I've also seen as well. But I think it's a nice clean animation that doesn't intrude very much as far as the any distraction for it, but it helps to easily track without needing to do any math or actually track a number. It's
That's right.
yeah, because I think my suggestion to you was, could I just have a countdown number and you were the one who came up with the ideas of actually using a visualization for this. So I like the improvement on that for sure.
Yeah, and this color, we could soften it if it's too distracting. So right now I'm keeping it a little bit darker so that we can see it on the video. But when, the reality is that if we go to the report now and we go to the say, go where we went before, you might find that's possibly a little too bold for our users. It's possibly a bit distracting. It's taking their eyes off the data. So you may want to soften that color down, make it a little more transparent, but you get the power to do that. But we can see now it's up, it's visible. We know roughly when it's going to change, with the exception of that loop. But we know it's going to cycle now.
Exactly. It takes away the jarring switch over. So very, very well done, I think, is a nice improvement to this for sure.
Yeah. So we can't, today, we want to keep this fairly short because me, I always come on and I talk the hind legs off what's going on, and I'm doing a pretty good job today. But we can use this idea to evolve it further. So we may not like the bar, but let's try a slightly different idea. So I'll just make that a little. I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to do a copy paste. We'll make this a 40 by 40. We'll put it up in the We'll put it up in the corner. and we'll edit it. And I'll just paste in here's one I made earlier. But it's the same principle. It's just taking the idea further. So we'll paste this in and we'll run it. And we'll just maybe make that a little bit bigger so we can see what's happening. And I'll just take that boundary marker off so that we've actually got a cleaner view. So now we've got this little circle that does a similar thing, but it goes around, and we've got a little counter in the middle. And how this works, it's basically the same. We've got our interval, we've got our start time, we've got our counter, we've got our adjusted counter. The only thing we have to do is think a little bit about how the circle works differently to the rectangle. So with Vega, if I go to the documentation, I can look up the mark documentation, and I can find the mark type that I want. So we used a rectangle before. We can use an arc, which lets us draw circular symbols. And we can play around and see. We've got our start angle and our end angle, and we can play with these in the site and see how they change.
Okay.
And
Like a clock
this
face,
is
yeah.
what we're going for. This is what we're going for. And we can change our inner radius. So it's a little more, it's like a little donut. But we can see these are parameters that we can actually, there are more than this, but this is just an example to show you how we can build this up. And that's the approach we take. The difference is we just use different things. Instead of the bar width, we create, instead of unit width, we create unit angle. So we use radians. So 360 degrees is 2 pi radians. So we divide 2 pi by the interval to get how much the circle should change on each clock cycle. And then we calculate, instead of bar width, we calculate the arc angle. So when the
For all
timer
those
updates,
friends who are like, you're never going to use geometry or math in the real world, like,
I think I may have
say,
put in a blog post recently. I did a blog post recently on the hill valley charts, the ones that kind of
mhm.
conditionally shade. I had to do a lot of trigonometry to work out intersection points of linear gradients. And I thought, if I could go back in time and tell 17-year-old me that I'm going to need that when I'm older, I'm going to squirrel that away, because I had to spend a lot of time going back and breaking out my math books and remembering how to calculate gradients of lines. And so it was good exercise, but it would have saved me a lot of time if I'd have just remembered. But yeah, this is the thing. You choose a chart. A lot of this is hidden away from you. But when you start to understand how charts are built, just like going back to using pen and paper. When, in primary school, when you used to, I don't know if you did, but I did. I used to build, they taught us how to create bar charts in primary school with graph paper and stuff. And all you do is you get a ruler and a pen, and you draw the rectangles, and you'd count how many squares. And this is kind of the same thing. All we're doing is calculating it in an automated way. So, we're saying each time the clock updates, what should that angle be? And what should the text value be? So what we do here is we just format the adjusted counter, we divide it by 1,000, and we give it 0 decimal places. And if we wanted to look a little different, we could put 1 decimal place on, and we get almost like a stopwatch. We can
I
show
like it, yeah.
the detail. I kind of personally like that because it's less distracting. But you can start to play with the idea. And the only things we had to do with circles, we have to calculate the center of, the center point.
Mm-hmm.
So we do, the center X and the center Y, because they don't work like rectangles, which start from the top and come out. And the only other thing we have to think about is, because our visual may be rectangular, we have to work out which is whether we should use the height or the width to constrain it. So this is just a way of saying use the smallest value, so that if the visual's taller than it is wide, we don't send it off the page. And we just do a similar thing. We draw an arc mark, and we bind those things to it when we create it, just like we did the rectangle. And we set that outer radius and inner radius so that it looks kind of donutty. But I could just as easily delete that inner radius, and we get a full circle instead of the donut. So you can play around a lot with it. You can bind all this stuff up and customize it to how it really wants to work. And then all we did was add another one for text. Same deal, put it in the middle and bind it to that calculated value.
Mm-hmm.
So with that approach that we outlined in the first one, all the way down here is the same. We're just changing the game a bit. So Yeah, that gives you a couple of things you can play with, and I'm sure there are creative people that can do heaps more stuff than I can. But hopefully, this gives you a slight intro to Vega and how you can possibly go down a little bit lower in the visual layer and start to play even a bit more than just making simple charts, building
Yeah,
dynamic
well,
things that help your user interactions on a report. But let's just jump back, and we'll see this one in situ, and then I will yield the screen. So there you go.
excellent. Yeah. It reminds me, well, also I think the fact that when I first approached you on this, I was thinking to use the HTML5 viewer. Just like, well, like we
Mm,
got to be able to do some kind of an animated vector or something else, because you can also draw and provide similar animated things. And there's another thing that I also was approaching you on related to that. I keep thinking that like, oh, this can be HTML code or an SVG or a vector image, and then it's like, oh, no, actually, no, we can turn Vega into the platform
yeah,
into building these. So I think it goes far beyond just visualizations for sure. It can add a lot of different elements that it does visualize something happening, but it's not just specifically bars, columns, or lines. It's going
yeah.
well beyond that. So I like the art of possible that I'm continuing to see with this tool for sure.
Yeah, totally. And the thing you got to, yeah, those HTML visuals, certainly the one I've done, HTML content. We don't, I don't support JavaScript in there, so you
Yep.
could feasibly do it, but it's very hard to debug and run JavaScript in there. So the other thing with HTML is you have to do all that physical stuff yourself, whereas the visual like
Yep.
Deneb, you bind it to data. It just so happens that the data here is the same as our physical coordinates, but we could just as easily have a anything you wanted with revised coordinates, and Vega Lite would work it out. And it's the same principle. You're binding shapes to a canvas and drawing them out. The nice thing about Vega is they've got a really nice encapsulation of some common events in JavaScript that would be really hard to do in those HTML visuals because of how Power BI works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is what I like is that you come to me with possibilities and we end up exploring them in Deneb because it probably gives us a more accessible entry point. And
Well, I
you've
mean, I
got
think
a
your feelings on this are probably similar to mine, where I get a lot of creative solutions, but I don't come up necessarily with the idea, but I provide a really cool way around it. So I love it when people come to me with like, hey, given the limitations of X, Y, and Z, how would you do this? Like, well, I never thought of connecting those two Lego bricks together in that way, metaphorically, but
mm,
here's how I can come up with a solution for that. So I think it's, you get similarly excited. Like people come to you with a unique scenario, like, all right, well, I haven't done that in Denim yet, but I could figure out a way to do that. And you come up with a really cool solution. Then it's kind of fun to like make something new that hasn't been built before, certainly.
yeah, it gives us all kinds of these are one of the reasons I can never take credit for the languages that it runs on. Vega and Vega Lite are amazing languages. All I'm really doing is bringing them into Power BI, but they are incredible tools to add to that tool belt of creative solutions. So it's not like a when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail scenario. Don't use denim for everything, but
Yeah.
think of it, in context. How could it suit the problem I have, rather than I should just throw denim at this thing? But there are challenges we can solve in Power BI that we don't think about. And like I say, you come to me with a problem, and a lot of people do. It's exciting to think of as instead of thinking, oh, we can't do that. It's exciting to think that yes, we could do that, and we can spend time with you to actually refine it. It's not just a case of fudging something to work. We can actually build it in a way that we think it should have worked to begin with, and then talk about is this right for you, and if it isn't, how can we change it and evolve it so that it serves your scenario, which is really really exciting.
Agreed. And I'm always of the opinion of the rising waters raise all ships in that degree. So I always appreciate doing community collaboration and content and seeing how other people approach a problem. Because like we have very strong horse blinders on ourselves in terms of how we tackle something, and there's a lot of unknown and unexposed that we probably wouldn't think of unless we collaborate with other individuals to see how else somebody would
Yeah,
approach this from a different perspective.
absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that one of the reasons I like Deneb and the HTML visuals so much is because I'm really just giving you a vehicle. But you as a person, you as a creator, you have the canvas and you can teach me
Yep.
stuff. You're not limited by the functionality I give you. you're able to do what you want almost, but you can teach me as well. And this is the coolest thing about these visuals, is just seeing what other people are doing.
Exactly. Well, Daniel, I appreciate you coming on for this again. Thank you so much. It's another great tutorial. I think we're, I'm collecting in that YouTube playlist quite a few of these Deneb and, well, nowadays definitely more Deneb, but I think between all the custom visual designs that we've done, I think this is the fourth or fifth, and hope to continue to add this. I know every time we do one of these, there's at least one comment like, "Can we get more of these videos, please?" So people are
Yeah,
usually very very keen on this. I guess, well, one video that I'll mention to continue to help kind of stand up and expose this, since it's an initiative, I also know is along the idea of custom visuals and just visualization in Power BI. I've recently had a chance to speak to Miguel Myers, and he is definitely he's in charge or being placed in charge of essentially the canvas and the visuals related to it. And what I've at least seen is he shared internally, and I guess with a few key players who he wants to help collaborate with, it is going to be insanely game changing. The number of new things that could come to both existing and new visuals, like this is what it should have been from day one, and this could actually make it
yeah,
compete with ClickView or Tableau or anything else. Like it's one of those where like you see the hint of a Christmas present, but then you know it's going to be probably a year or two before it actually comes out. So like I am now just eagerly chomping at the bit to like I cannot wait for this next to come out and for this dream to become reality essentially. But I am really excited for that. So I think
yeah,
it's in the last couple of years with custom visuals like Deneb filling in the gap for the need to make them, but then further push to actually allow for native visuals to have further customization and configurations. I think in like 2 years time, Power BI is going to be really powerful, not just as a modeling tool, which is kind of how I sell it today. I think I can say without having to use the, well, here's a bunch of exceptions to certain, like it won't be nearly as hard to sell the visualization layer. So I cannot wait for
mhm,
that stuff. But I know he's trying to get traction for it, so I like to continue just to mention it whenever I can now that we've
yeah.
spoken.
I can second that. It's a really really bold vision. Um,
Yeah,
Very very impressed with what I've seen, and it will be great to see it hopefully get realized. And it will
exactly.
definitely give people a lot more opportunity to build more visual, more rich solutions.
With less time and less skill needed to do
Yep,
it too. Yeah,
absolutely.
which is the
Yeah, and
is the
that's what
big
it's all
thing.
about.
Yeah. 100%. Like the was it the seconds to insight, or 5 minutes to walk kind of a thing. You want people to truly be able to, to get to that with as little time as possible. But last
Yeah, totally.
yeah, thing just to mention for here, but otherwise, thank you so much for coming on, and we will have you back on again, I'm sure in the near future.
Yeah, I would like to say, if you've ever got a problem, you can give me a call. I'd love to come back on and help work through it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
No worries. Cheers, Reed. Thanks.
Cheers. Please don't forget to like, comment, or share this video. Now, if this is your first time to my channel, or you want to see more of these awesome videos, please click that subscribe and notification button. Also, feel free to show your support by becoming a channel member. Last but not least, you can download the file for today's video from my blog files page using the link down below. So until next time.